Okay, so let's talk about chivalry, shall we? We all know and love the ideals of chivalry, right? I mean, who doesn't?
Knightly codes of honor, virtue, and respect, emulating great heroic figures from literature like Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, or King Arthur from the Arthurian mythology. Could there be anything more worthwhile than pursuing those lauded ideals of proper behavior and decorum?
Well, the short answer is not really. The fact of the matter is that chivalry, as a concept, is less a rigorous code of strict rules and regulations than it is a nebulous collection of ideologies and social functions that work to dictate how certain socioeconomic classes are to interact with one another. What we lack are any written texts expressly defining what the rules surrounding chivalry are. As a historian in training, the lack of written information on a subject means one of two things to me.
1. The information in question was so common knowledge that it was deemed unnecessary to explain in detail what the events in question were. Or 2. The information in question didn't actually exist, or we have yet to find it.
As you might guess, these are two completely different possibilities. Furthermore, by chivalry's very nature, the rules surrounding chivalry are exclusionary, not just in gendered terms, but social status terms as well.
I bring this up because of a recent article that I read in a news publication, here using the term news in as liberal a sense as possible, the Epoch Times. Now, I did not subscribe to this publication, nor did anyone else that I live with. I had never heard of the Epoch Times until it made a surprise appearance in my mailbox, and you can imagine my alarm when I read that chivalry was dead because women killed it!
Reading the article, Treat Her Like a Lady, Let's Bring Chivalry Back by the Epoch Times writer Jeff Minick, I was astounded by what I read. Had I exclusively read an opinion piece about what someone's understandings as to what chivalry entailed, I wouldn't have given the article a second thought. However, I read an article rife with incorrect attributions, anecdotes standing in for fact, blatant anti-feminism, and sensationalist far-right ideology posing a historical fact. And that got my historical and literary hackles raised. Knowing full well that a less informed person might read this article and come to some very incorrect conclusions, I sat down to critique this article in full and compose this video essay.
Unraveling the nature and history of chivalry entails not only a look into medieval romantic literature, but also delving into the foundation of conservative ideology in 18th and 19th century England, and counter-feminist movements with the effort to restrict women's rights and freedoms, although intention can be debated.
Sounds a little sensationalist to me, but hey, that's what a good YouTube video is for, right? According to Minick, a columnist for the Epoch Times and retired homeschool teacher in North Carolina, chivalry was an unquestionably beneficial element of old society that we have lost in our postmodernist age and are all the worse for it. His article, broken down into 6 parts with an introduction, recounts his beliefs about the moral decay of society and how real men ought to treat the women around them as ladies. Now, I'm going to do something a little unconventional here and say that at the most fundamental levels, I agree with some of Minick's assessments. As a cis white hetero male, I should treat women with respect, compassion, and politeness. Similarly, I'm going to treat any men I encounter the same way. The trouble is, treating someone respectfully and politely is, Canadian stereotypes aside, part of behaving in an operational society. But Minick attributes these behaviors to a lost code of chivalry and suggests that our modern world is lacking in these things. His evidence? Anecdotes, almost exclusively. Allow me to read a few lines from his article.
In our own time, chivalry, this long-practiced etiquette, has taken some hits. Our postmodernist society has declared chivalry dead and locked the White Knight in the dungeon of his castle.
There are a few things that bother me with this assessment. Most strikingly is the White Knight being locked in the dungeons bit. Now, I can appreciate that Minick might be a little out of the loop on internet language and not entirely familiar with modern slang, but referring to anyone as a white knight is generally not a favorable thing.
I had been, prior to this video essay's research, familiar with the term and its connotations of being a man who defends women and or befriends them with the expectations of sexual favors in return. But having read up further on the subject, the definition got worse.
But assuming this was an honest mistake on Minick's part, he's still suggesting that our society is somehow less civilized than it used to be, and its people less respectful. To back up his claim, he cites an anecdote about an anonymous 1880 Texas woman who was treated respectfully by roughnecks because of how she behaved.
Or how his homeschooled students during seminars would respond to a hypothetical situation involving their black belt girlfriend, a drunkard, and a surprise fight. Now, just as an aside, Minick, you don't win a black belt, you earn a black belt. It requires a lot of time, dedication, effort. You don't just it's not like a raffle. You don't sign up and be like, oh, lucky number 37, you won your black. No, you earn it. You go to the tournaments, you attend the class. It's a small thing. It bothers me. Anyway, moving on.
Most galling in his claims is that chivalry was partially devised by Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and created a code of conduct that lasted for 35 generations uninterrupted. Okay, so for starters, I have no idea where Minick got that idea from. All the research I've done indicates that chivalric culture was primarily a literary trope that was popular amongst the ruling classes, rather than being an ideology created from the aristocracy and disseminated from there. Second, the term generations is an incredibly imprecise measurement of time. In many cases, one could argue that generations are an entirely fictionalized way of measuring social changes that don't mean anything.
A definition I found through Google paints the window of time of a generation as being between 20 to 30 years in length. So, according to Minick, chivalry officially died in either 1904 or will die in 2254?
Whew! Case closed, lads. Chivalry is still alive. But in 233 years, we marched to war to defend a literary trope. But therein lies the problem. Chivalry started as, and predominantly was, a literary trope in the genre of the French Romance tradition. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms,
the principal kind of romance found in medieval Europe from the 12th century onwards, describing, usually in verse, the adventures of legendary knights and celebrating an idealized code of civilized behavior that combines loyalty, honor, and courtly romance. The emphasis on heterosexual love and courtly manners distinguishes it from the chanson de geste and other kinds of epic, in which masculine military heroic predominates.
Now, that might seem strange. Why would the ruling caste choose to build their code of conduct around a literary trope, especially one that was created by the lower social orders? Well, as was the case through much of English history, the ruling elite viewed themselves as morally superior to the people they commanded. Tying a reputation to a moral idealism that was not only popular amongst the masses, but well regarded amongst most social castes, was and is a potent way of reinforcing one's political worth. Something we continue to see to this day in more right-leaning political parties, but more on that later.
This was especially useful when those ruling classes were not only wealthy, but also powerful in militaristic terms. The mythos of chivalry gave an air of moral superiority to not only excuse, but laud violence in an otherwise Christian society. As anyone who has studied the Christian Crusades in the medieval period can attest, the idea of righteous murder, something very much at odds with the majority of Christian teachings, required a fair bit of philosophical and theological gymnastics. Part of this might stem from the pre-Christian warrior culture that was more prevalent in most Germanic and Frankish peoples, mixing with more Iberian Christian teachings in odd ways.
To find something resembling a codified list on the rules of chivalry, we have to turn to the historical documents we have. Where we lack in written information on the real-world rules of chivalry, we have an abundance of stories and tales, many of them either outright fiction or so far removed from reality that the Hollywood phrase based on true events comes to mind, featuring either chivalric characters or chivalry itself. The legends surrounding the mythic figure of King Arthur come most readily to mind, but so do the Canterbury Tales and the history of William Marshall. Here's an excerpt on the latter on Marshall's combat prowess and code of conduct.
The day of the tourney the knights all came, in front of their refuge they remained, until they were well and truly armed. And know ye that, before the joust yard, such tournaments did not have rules, nor did one dispute or discuss, except to lose or win it all. The marshal studied him carefully. Forthwith he left the gathering. He spurred on his horse Blancart. Between them he raced with all his might, and took Philip's mount by the reins. By sheer strength the marshal pulled his horse out of the midst of the tournament. The marshal asked for Philip's word and trusted him to stay outside, so the marshal could continue to fight. And when he had left his prisoner, he threw himself back into the fray, so he took another knight. He fought so well that the knight submitted, and said he was his prisoner, so 2 wealthy hostages had he. With no injuries and no cause for shame, he put his hand to taking a third. He did so well and fought so hard that this knight also yielded his sword. And another knight came to him as his prisoner was dismounting, and said, "Since I fought at your side, we should split the price of this horse." "Very well," said the marshal to him, "whenever you wish to depart, we'll split the spoils before you leave." After speaking, he regretted his words, but he never went back on his word.
This small excerpt from the lengthy poem about William Marshall highlights several interesting details, and it's really a shame more people aren't familiar with it. First of all, there were no actual rules involved in these tournament battles, and this was expected of all participants, who included, amongst others, the King of Scotland. Second, that when someone lost, the winner was permitted to take the loser as hostage to ransom them back to their family or estate for reward. This is outlined in greater detail in later tournaments, which I omitted for time's sake. And really, if there's one element of chivalry that needs to be brought back, it's the idea that if you best someone in a tournament, you can lay claim to all their stuff. Another great example of the benevolent knight who upholds chivalric ideas and embodies those values is the nameless knight character from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. In the general prologue, one of the first characters we are introduced to is
A nicht there was, and that a worthy man, that fro the time that he first began, to reason out he loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy.
Again, this knight is described in the most virtuous of terms, but chivalry, honor, freedom, and courtesy are all separate entities. Had all these virtues been part and parcel of the umbrella term chivalry, Chaucer would not likely have felt the need to explain in greater detail. I have not included any of the numerous myths involving King Arthur or the myriad of characters from the court of Camelot, many of them upholding the chivalric ideals that many of us would recognize to some extent today. Despite this, however, historians warn that their real-world counterparts, the actual medieval knights who donned the trappings of chivalry,
often fail to be so just and benevolent to their subjects.
However, it's apparent that something about this mythology was so endearing that it survived well past its age. And while it'd be a fair assumption to make that most of us are glad we don't actually live in an agrarian feudal society, the idea of a chivalric code has persisted well into the modern day and has changed drastically from the original form. To know why that is, we need to skip right over the early modern period and into the smoggy, steamy, industrial period of the 18th century onward.
Capitalism, ho!
To begin with, I'm going to read you an excerpt from the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1956 edition, and we're going to play a rousing game of Spot the Difference.
Chivalry, the knightly class of feudal times. The primary sense in the Middle Ages is knights or fully armed and mounted fighting men. Thence the term came to mean that gallantry and honor expected of knights. Lastly, the word came to be used in its general sense of courtesy.
Bit of a sudden shift there. The literal nobility was removed in favor of a general sense of the term pertaining to courtesy. In history, however, this was less of a sudden shift and more of an ongoing gradual social change. While chivalric language made a bit of a minor resurgence in the early 17th century, for the most part, that other darling of neoliberals was in vogue.
That antiquated and sophisticated world of classical Greece and imperial Rome.
As a result of advances in the scientific fields, many of which built upon classic philosophical teachings and theories, the medieval period was increasingly being seen as the brutal and barbaric age that bears much resemblance to George R.R. Martin's grim fantasy setting. But that began to change with this newfangled problem in the aristocratic world called democracy. Shortly following the events of the French Revolution, many rulers were becoming increasingly concerned that guillotines would be making the tours to their hometowns. Enter one Edmund Burke, largely credited with being the founder of political conservatism. In his seminal Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke recounted his meeting with the, at the time still living, Queen Marie Antoinette.
Little did I dream that I should have lived to see disasters falling upon her in a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honor, and of cavaliers. I thought 10,000 swords must have leapt from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has seceded, and the glory of England is extinguished forever.
Instead, Burke emphasized that it was important to adhere to traditional, rigid, caste-based systems, and that humanity was an inherently emotion-driven species and should, therefore, have freedoms limited by an autocratic ruler for the betterment of society. The religious connotations were reinforced by a diplomat to the King of Sardinia, one Joseph de Maistre, who asserted that the suffering caused by the French Revolution was God's punishment for the arrogance of Enlightenment philosophers in thinking they could create new societies without divine direction. As one can imagine, these ideas would be rather appealing to someone who was an aristocrat with support from the church, especially one who felt that their legitimacy was being threatened by the plebeians, who wanted a say in running the nation. King George III very much embraced these conservative ideals, and what better package to wrap them up in than in medieval chivalry? Of course, King George was not the first modern English monarch to employ chivalry to stabilize their rule.
Queen Elizabeth I built herself a cult of chivalry. While being divorced from the practical elements of modern warfare, it was nevertheless crucial in maintaining loyalty when her rule was at greatest risk of invasion from the Spanish.
But whereas Queen Elizabeth's primary concern was the threat of foreign invasion, King George's primary concern was that a free press and a democratic state would render the royal family obsolete. And let's be honest,
You right.
but while the balance of political power shifted away from the landed gentry and aristocracy and into the hands of wealthy business owners and the urban bourgeoisie, chivalric imagery is co-opted and embraced, first by those wealthy families that lived in country estates and large manors. The idea that these lords and esquires were wealthy and powerful because they were morally superior to everyone else because of social Darwinism was, to say the least, comforting. To counter the onslaught of horrible things like democracy and capitalism, the minds of Sir Kenelm Digby, Thomas Carlyle, Edward Fitzgerald, Charles Kingsley, and other critical thinkers of the time were brought together to create a sort of code of conduct for good Christian knights. Those traits were being brave, straightforward, honorable, loyal to the monarch, country, and friends, unfailingly true to his word, defender of women, child, or animal. Natural leader of men, fearless in war and the hunt, excelled at all manly sports. Tough with the tough, but gentle with the weak. Tender, respectful, and courteous to women, to put the needs of others before himself, charitable with time, money, and resources, only played games for pleasure and not to win, never boasted, disinterested in money, a faithful lover, and disdained all coarse and uncouth talk. A pretty straightforward and easy to follow list, obviously.
And while some of these traits can be seen as having a one-to-one relationship with much of the chivalric literature of the past, you can draw straight parallels between the poem about William Marshall and several of the aforementioned traits. Some of those seem antithetical to medieval ideologies.
Instead, it appeared that someone had taken those loose series of literary tropes and updated them, and that someone was Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott's family had lost much of their fortune and prestige because of poor investment and financial management choices. Being from a prominent Scottish familial line, this made Scott not only nostalgic for, but romanticized the medieval past of his ancestry.
However, being a scholar himself and well-read on the subject, Scott knew that chivalry, in its original fuzzy literary form, was out of step with 19th century ideologies. His most well-known work, Ivanhoe, can be considered central to many of his contemporaries' impressions on how modern gentlemanly chivalry was to be perceived, and, most importantly, emulated. However, while following many of these chivalric ideas might seem beneficial to society on a whole, there carries a very problematic subset of ideals that, while wrapped up in chivalric lore, can be harmful to a particular demographic of society. That is to say, and brace yourself for the clickbaity reveal here, chivalry can be misogynistic and perpetuate sexist ideologies. Returning to Minick's article for a spell, we see that he outlines a few variables about how men ought to treat women. However, many of the details within are, while I do believe born out of a genuine desire to be a respectful and compassionate individual towards others, reinforces concepts that carry negative consequences. I've already mentioned the vague anecdote about the Texan woman previously, and while I won't linger on it too much longer, I will suggest it is phrased in a very poor way, where here it falls on women to behave properly around men, else face the consequences. The reasoning is very much in line with people who demean the victims of sexual assault, saying things like, well, maybe you shouldn't have dressed so provocatively, or maybe you shouldn't have led them on, and so on. In addition to this, however, Minick also postulates that some feminists contend that once common gentlemanly acts, pulling out a chair in the restaurant for your date, opening the door of the car, paying the tab at the wine bar, demean women, making them appear the weaker sex, reinforcing the view that women need men to help them. Now, had I, a white heterosexual cisgendered middle-class male, been asked about such things prior to researching the subject, I'd have said these are all harmless actions to perform for women, let alone other people. But I've since learned of a concept that sheds some light on how these actions might be perceived by those who are very much not part of my demographics. Doctors Julia C. Becker and Stephen C. Wright conducted a study in 2011 testing to see how women would respond when faced with hostile and benevolent sexism. Specifically, they were testing to see how participants would be interested in engaging in active social change when presented with these two polar opposite forms of sexism with gender-neutral elements in the control group. Now, if you're like me and had never heard of these two terms before, here's a brief summation.
Hostile sexism is what most of us would stereotypically attribute with sexist actions. Patronizing women, demeaning women with cruelty or abuse, suggesting that women use their sexuality to leverage power from men, etc. Whereas benevolent sexism is, as they put it, an affectionate or chivalric expression of male dominance, i.e., treating women as the fairer sex, suggesting that women require men to protect and care for them, or implying that a relationship with a woman will fulfill a man, amongst others.
The study is a really fascinating read, and I found it very informative for how my actions might negatively affect women. And while I don't have the necessary time to go over the study in greater detail, I highly suggest that anyone who is interested in it read it thoroughly. It's also very accessibly written for ignorant people, like myself, to understand the concepts and philosophies that are central to the thesis. While this study was specifically testing to see how participants would feel like they needed to engage in proactive social change, the results still well serve our purposes here. It is unsurprising, excuse the dog moving around, it is unsurprising that participants exposed to hostile sexism would feel like they needed to engage in proactive social change for better equality. But women exposed to benevolent sexism were more mollified and felt like social change was less needed when compared to the gender-neutral control group. This is not to say that the study is a hard and fast fact, but the results, and what they suggest, should be considered in greater detail and tested more widely. Benevolent sexism is very much rooted in traditional chivalric language. Of that list I mentioned in the section previous, the idea that one should be a defender of women does strongly imply that women are incapable of defending themselves, and instead of cooperation with women, they are relegated to a more reverential role. While many of Minick's ideas appear to be rooted in respecting women as individuals, the ideas he shares appear more in line with distant admiration.
The idea that chivalry is about the creation of stable marriage arrangements is very much counter to what classic courtly love, and therefore chivalric romance, literature was about. The quintessential paragon of the courtly romance, Sir Lancelot du Lac, was strictly about admiring his true love, Lady Guinevere, King Arthur's wife, from afar, and never pursuing any effort of consummating that affection.
Not unlike the alleged code of chivalry, this underwent a drastic change in the early 19th century. For his defense, Minick calls upon Suzanne Venker, self-proclaimed feminist critic and certified marriage coach, to defend his view that chivalry is dead. Venker claims that it is paramount for women to bring back chivalry if they wish to encourage the making of mature, respectful, marriage-minded men. And here we see we should never trust anything Venker has to say about chivalry. Any sheepish viewers might want to skip ahead of this part. It's about naughty things. Prior to the 19th century revival of chivalric ideas, purity was a part of the courtly love genre. However, where modern definitions might fail, purity did not mean
Virginity! Virginity, as we know it, was largely restricted to Catholic clergymen. Purity was not intended for exclusively women prior to marriage, although in more aristocratic circles, that was important for purposes of legitimacy and heirs. But purity as a concept was practiced by both men and women.
More importantly, purity was the idea that sex was only to be engaged with after marriage, or if you deeply loved the person. Now, why do I bring this all up? Did Minick's article specify anything about sex or the like? Directly, no. Indirectly, yes. Minick's constant jabs at postmodernism suggests he is unhappy with the current ideologies of the modern age. And much of this seems to stem from his criticisms of, as Venker puts it, the modern generation that is largely a product of divorce. Instead, we are supposed to embrace chivalry, praise men for God's sake. The issue here, however, is that Venker isn't really an expert on chivalry, and I'd suggest not a very reliable marriage coach either.
In her own case, she admits that because she and her husband used to be at odds with one another, quote, "My husband, who, like me, has a strong will, would insist that I stop being so critical and argumentative, and I, in turn, had my frustrations with him," end quote. Her solution was to instead change who she was to become more subservient to him.
Never mind this being potentially very harmful to her. After all, I've known individuals who've escaped from violently abusive relationships, and their ex-partners would have loved nothing more for those victims to just become more submissive and to fall in line. This is decidedly unchivalric overall.
The goal of chivalry was never to ensure stable, Christian-oriented marriages. That was simply a fabrication of Victorian-era poets like Alfred Tennyson. To suggest that chivalry, as we perceive it today, was established over half a millennium ago, as Minick does, is outrageous. What it is, instead, is a medievalist revisionism that was popularized by late 18th and early 19th century poets and authors, with very little by the way of historical accuracy.
Moreover, many elements that are quintessential to the courtly love genre can be harmful to others. The well-known trope in romance films and trashy literature of the modern age is that of the stalker with a crush, where one character loves another character from a distance, and sometimes that distance is quite short. However, outside of being a lazy writing technique, those who emulate this trope in reality, because they are loyal to their true love, could be forcing their affections onto someone who does not want it. And while some might find this trope endearing, it can also make others very uncomfortable very quickly, and, if pressed too hard, can become a form of, as the trope name suggests, stalking, if not a form of sexual harassment. This is not to say that one can't ever engage in behavior such as holding the door open or pulling out a chair. Rather, be mindful of who is on the receiving end of such actions and aware of their response. Some might find such actions as pulling out a chair at the restaurant for your date, opening the door of the car, paying the tab at the wine bar, charming and appreciated. Others might find it patronizing. The only way to know the difference is to actively practice exactly what Minick suggests in his article. Communicate and listen. As I mentioned at the beginning of this tirade, some of the most basic elements of what Minick suggests are worth practicing. Respect others. Actively listen during conversation. Be open and honest about your thoughts and feelings. And practice proper chivalric ideology by holding your defeated opponents for ransom. Oh, hey Sarah, what's up?
Hey man, I was wondering if you were up for another round of Mario Kart so I can smoke you again.
Yeah, I really can't this time. No, sorry.
Coward, why not?
Well, it's you have my Switch. I can't play because you won my Switch from last time.
Nah, I don't see what that's got to do with anything.
Well, what do you want me to do? I can't just like make a new Switch out of thin air and have to go and get a new one.
That's not the point right now. The point is that I'm up for Mario Kart and I want to own you again. So hop online, loser. Come on.
What one shouldn't do, however, is listen to the details of the nonsense that Minick is pandering in his article. The Epoch Times, while claiming to be an award-winning article, is little better than your bog-standard neoliberal propaganda rag. Chivalry, if it ever lived, died long before the rise of postmodernism and the modern generation. And instead of looking backwards at trying to see how things were once great long ago, in a time before proper hygiene, let's try looking critically at the problems we face presently. The codes of chivalry were, at best, a fuzzy series of loose concepts largely invented by troubadours and writers to create compelling narratives to entertain audiences. It's a genre that's rife with contradictions, and for entertainment purposes, that's entirely fine. But as aristocratic figures saw their dominance in the political sphere being threatened, these literary tropes were co-opted into a set of cultural ideals that were intended, by and large, to stifle democratic progress and ensure strict patriarchal hierarchies. Remember, a vote for conservatism is vote to reinstate an absolutist monarchy. Our Western culture idolizes the concepts of freedom and equality, but equality cannot be obtained if one gender is relegated to the delicate damsel role.
Chivalry is often co-opted as an excuse for violent behavior in men and passivity in women amongst neoliberals and far-right extremists. And as such, we should be incredibly suspicious of people who insist on an unequivocal return to building our societal standards around what amounts to nothing more than a literary trope in fiction.
Instead, we should be insisting on being critical of our presuppositions over what actions and manners are right and proper, and be receptive to listening to the social other. The meme notwithstanding, we live in a society. But that society is a creature of our collective creation. Minick is right. Do cherish, love, respect, and be open with others. Whether that's with your partner, with your family, your friends, or with strangers you don't know that well. Just, he's wrong about everything else, especially when it comes to chivalry. But that's fine. I'm sure we can settle our differences over a nice and civil joust.